Here we are at chapter 7 of The Treasure Hunter's Tale. About a week or so later, and very early in the morning, when the sun was just coming up over the hill line, Mr. Saved-by-Grace woke suddenly. He sat up in bed and listened. There it was again, an unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof, creeping. Whoever it was up there clearly didn't want to be heard, but roofs in those days were so creaky and noisy that to try and sneak on such a surface unnoticed was quite out of the question. He got out of bed and unsheathed his sword, for of course he was always in his armour. He went quietly to the window and drew back the curtain. The sunlight streamed through the window and dazzled the other two hunters, and they too awoke, and, seeing Mr. Saved-by-Grace with his sword wet and ready for action, they too prepared for an attack. But nothing happened, and the sound of the footsteps suddenly went away. "Well, that was odd," said Mr. Saved-by-Grace. "There was certainly someone out there." "Aye," agreed Mr. Newhart, "but who? And why did they leave so suddenly?" "All good questions," said Mr. Discover-the-Truth, sheathing his sword, "but the danger seems to be over, so let us not worry and go down to breakfast." The other treasure hunters agreed, and still alert, got washed and went downstairs. On the table was already laid out a lovely breakfast, and the men enjoyed it most heartily, talking of their adventures and rejoicing in the king. Just as they were clearing away, there was a noise at the door, and in rushed two brigands fairly bristling with weapons of a horrible sort, and covered all over in scars and markings. They at once leapt at Mr. Newhart and began to try to strip him of his armour. So sudden was the attack that poor Mr. Newhart barely had time to go to his sword, but just managed to grab it when one of the evil men knocked his hand so hard that he let it go. The man was wild-eyed and was clearly very focused on something, so focused in fact that he did not notice Mr. Saved-by-Grace come up behind him until he had made his first blow. "The Lord is righteous. He hath cut asunder the cords of the wicked." The man staggered back. Then Mr. Saved-by-Grace struck again, because although it is good form to let an opponent recover when the fight is with men, it is not at all the thing to do when fighting against the evil one's slaves, when they are baying for your blood. "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Mr. Newhart wheeled round, grabbed his sword, and then, seeing the brigand already dispatched by valiant Mr. Saved-by-Grace, sprang to the other man, who was just about to slit the throat of Mr. Discover-the-Truth with a dirty, wretched dagger he had in his fist called No Mercy. Mr. Newhart plunged his sword into the heart of the man and pulled it out again. "He that rejects the king and does not receive his words, the word that the king has spoken, will judge him on the last day." The man slumped to the floor. "Well," breathed Mr. Newhart, "I suppose that clears up the mystery from this morning." The men sent fervent messages of thanks to the king, and then cleared up the kitchen, for the chairs and tables had been flung about in the fight. As they were clearing away, Mr. Discover-the-Truth noticed a raised plank in the wooden floor. He stamped on it, and the sound was echoey. "Hello," he said. "I may have found something here." He knelt down and lifted up the planks of wood, and sure enough there was a small empty room beneath the floor of the kitchen, and, lighting candles, the men went below to investigate. At the very end of the room there was a large flat wooden box, and inside it was a single scroll of very old papyrus. The men carefully unrolled it, and saw at the top was written Isaiah 53. And then below the whole chapter, written carefully out in ancient language, the which, with the help of their glasses, given to them by the officer, they were able to read. Now, for those of you who do not yet know of the King's Road, or are maybe new to it, then in the Bible there is a book called Isaiah, and chapter 53 is a wonderful and accurate prophecy of the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's so amazing and has so many details which were, of course, later fulfilled 700 years later. And since then, many people do not like to have people read that chapter, as it is evidence that Jesus really is who he says he is. Do read it, though, for it's full of wonderful things. "So maybe this is what they were after?" queried Mr. Saved-by-Grace. "To destroy it, you mean?" asked Mr. Discover-the-Truth. "Aye, and us too in the bargain, I shouldn't wonder," said Mr. Newhart warmly, "for it is the very evidence that the king's son Emmanuel is the Christ indeed." "So another treasure is found, but surely it should not be hidden away in this box under the floors of an old kitchen," said Mr. Saved-by-Grace. "No," agreed the other two men heartily, "it should be shared with others." And so it was that they made many copies of the treasure in many languages and gave them out as tracts as they walked on their journey from that day onward. As they walked along, they came upon a valiant-looking young man who was standing in the road ahead of them with his two-edged sword drawn. However, when he saw that the men too had two-edged swords, and these were only ever handed out to those who met the king at the hill called Salvation, that he sheathed his once more and stepped forward. "Well met, gentlemen," he said in a hearty tone, which sounded like he had been expecting them to be robbers or the evil one himself, and was greatly relieved to find they were not. "Well met," replied the treasure hunters. "But what, pray, is your story? For you seem very relieved to meet us just now," asked Mr. Discover-the-Truth kindly. The young man shook hands heartily with the three men with his left hand, which the hunters thought unusual, as it is customary to firmly grip with the right, but they didn't say so. "Relieved indeed," he said, "for I did but think you were the brigands who are after me these many weeks." "Brigands?" asked Mr. Saved-by-Grace, raising his eyebrows and looking at his two friends. "Yes, and jolly dastardly men too they are," breathed the young man. "Were," corrected Mr. Newhart quietly to his friends. "What was that you say? Were? But does that mean—" "Yes, indeed, brother, for just now they accosted us in our dwelling place and fair near killed us, but our swords were wet and the king gave us victory." "Oh, may the king be praised," cried out the young man, "for now my name is truly my state, for I am Mr. Set Free, and set free I have now truly been, thanks to you fellows and your faithfulness to our king." He looked with rapturous joy at his new companions. "I see I have need to explain myself," he said, "but first, gentlemen, let us be better acquainted. As I said, my name is Mr. Set Free, Mr. Wandering Eye as was." The hunters introduced themselves, and the young Mr. Set Free continued. "When I was a younger man, about 14, if you can call that a man," he added passionately, "I was in the field one day when the late brigands, Dr. Filth and Mr. Vile, as were, approached me carrying a cage covered in a golden mantle. They were, you understand, not half so ugly and wretched as they had become when you saw them just now. No, they were all well dressed and neatly spoken. They addressed me as though I was a grown man, which filled me greatly with pride. Then they started to tell me of strange and mystical things, of things that at the time were enticing and alluring to me. They lastly told me that they wanted to loan me their pet, and that it would sit on my arm and do as it was told, and fill me with pleasure and satisfy my deepest and darkest longings." He kicked at the ground. "That, brothers, was a lie, a wicked and deceiving death blow to my heart and life and any future joy. But at the time it seemed exciting, and this was before I had even seen beneath the golden mantle. Of course, money had to be exchanged, but they only asked a few pennies, with the understanding that I would pay them each month a few pennies for the pleasure of having access to such an enticing beast, and so I readily handed it over. Then they lifted the mantle, and there, sitting all shimmery but very much alive, was a small baby dragon. The last of its kind, I was told, although, of course, I know this to be another wicked falsity." He spat out the last word. "Well, the dragon was mine, and then the men walked away with the promise of return the next month. The little creature, who I called Lusty, was small and enjoyable to play with, but his talons did prick into my skin rather when he perched on my arm. Anyway, brothers, this beast grew and grew over the months until it had such a grip on me that I wanted rid of it, but somehow I couldn't let it go. On the months went, and yes, each month I paid the pennies, but soon the big, red, dangerous dragon was fully grown, for dragons of Lusty's breed grow big very quickly, and his talons were so dug into my arm that it was like he was part of me. Indeed, when he flew, I went with him, not that I wanted to or enjoyed it, but simply because I had to. I was getting desperate and would often cry out for help. This beast was consuming me. Gradually he was leading and dragging, and still those talons dug in deeper. Then one day I was given a piece of paper by a tall, one-armed gentleman who smiled at me and said, "There's hope, lad, for the likes of us. Ask the king. He can help thee, for his son can take away all sins, so he can, and has too if you ask him." And on the paper it said, "If thy right hand offends thee, cut it off, for it is better to enter the kingdom of heaven with one hand than to have both hands and be cast into hell." Well, I don't have to tell you again, I was desperate, and it wasn't just my hand. My whole arm was offensive to me, so great was the brute that sat on it. I cried to the king for help, and then I took a hatchet and cut through my arm with a ready will. The pain was horrendous, but nothing compared with the sweet relief I felt when the dragon was at last no longer attached to me. He flew away with my arm still in his talons. I stemmed the blood well and then cried out to the king, thanking him for his great rescue. He told me to meet him at the hill called Salvation, and I went with a ready will, and when he gave me my new name, I could have hugged him, Mr. Set Free. The men looked at one another, and each in his own heart understood. "And the brigands?" asked Mr. Discover-the-Truth slowly. Oh, they were after me for losing their dragon, and had vowed, once they discovered my delight in the king, to seek out and destroy as many of his scriptures as they could. I wager that is why they came upon us in the house just now, observed Mr. Discover-the-Truth, for the treasure we discovered there was one of the most critical of scriptures for proving the king's words about his son Prince Emmanuel are true. And the king has just these 2 months ago given me a new commission, continued Mr. Setfree, and I am to go about slaying all the dragons and eggs and nests I can find so no one else gets taken in, although, he sighed, wiping his brow, I think it'll be my life's work, and when I reach the end I will still only be a fraction done. He sighed again and then took a deep breath. So anyway, that is why I say I am my name truly now, for being pursued and chased all over the country by those villains who would put an end to me, or at the very least an end to my purpose, was very vexing, and made me feel trapped once more. But now, thank the king, I am once more set free. And the king gave me this, he said, tapping his metal right arm, and of sounder quality I couldn't wish. Just look at the engraving, he said, brandishing his right arm for the men to see. The engraving carved into the metal arm was this: Fear not, I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. Truly, said Mr. Setfree, what was once my greatest burden has now been replaced quite literally with my greatest treasure. A treasure indeed, observed Mr. Saved-by-Grace, making a note of the engravings in his notebook. The men walked on together with their new companion, and each stored what they had heard in their hearts. The next morning Mr. Setfree took his leave and wished them good and safe passage, and then was off, tracking another fiend to slay.